Scratching, clawing, screaming, and crying echoed across the stormy seas as survivors clung to the upturned keel of the ship. Victims within the ship begged for mercy from God and help from those around them. Survivors clung to the ship with all of the strength they had left, and survivors in the seas thrashed against the wind and waves. The survivors prayed for a quick rescue, one that would come too late. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for our younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. This week we get into a part of the world we don't spend much time in on this channel, Africa. Specifically the westernmost country in Africa, the Republic of Senegal. The country is bordered by Mauritania to the north, Mali to the east, Guinea to the southeast, the Gambia right in the center of the country, and Guinea-Bissau to the southwest, situated nicely on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. The Gambia cuts through part of the country, separating the northern part of the country from the southern region of Casamance. The economic and political capital of the country is Dakar. Because the country was once under French colonial rule, French is the official language of Senegal. Now that we have a little background on Senegal, let's look at the ship itself. She was ordered by the Ministère de l'Equipement of Dakar sometime before 1990 and built by Shipwrecks in Germany. She was launched on March 22, 1990, passing her sea trials and being completed on November 12, 1990. MV Joola was named after the Joola people of southern Senegal, and her route would go from Dakar to Casamance and back. Before we get any further into her story, let's look at her specs. MV Joola was a RORO ferry that was 79.5 meters long, had a beam of 12 meters wide, and a draft of 3.1 meters deep. For her tonnage, she clocked in at 2,087 gross tons and weighed in at 1,400 metric tons. She was equipped with some of the latest safety equipment available at the time of the disaster, and she had 2 motors. She was capable of carrying 35 cars and 536 passengers, serviced by an average crew of 44. The ship had 1 stern door for loading cars onto the ship, and she was painted white with green accents and a red keel, with 2 side-by-side funnels, each displaying the Senegalese flag and a coat of arms. Her call sign was 6VYZ, and her IMO number was 901-9901. Though the ship was owned by the Ministry of Equipment, the Armed Forces of Senegal were in charge of the ship's operations as of 1995 in order to verify passenger identities. However, overcrowding was always an issue. MV Joola typically traveled twice a week on her short route, with her typical passengers being women who sold mangoes and palm oil in Dakar. The ship was introduced as a solution to the geographical challenges of living in Senegal. The Gambia cuts off the Casamance region from the rest of the country, and travel options were limited in the 1990s. Either you traveled a damaged eastern road by car, or took the western sea route. And since road attacks during a separatist rebellion were taking place, your best bet was by sea, despite the risks from consistent overcrowding on MV Joola as well as other ships that service this route. We don't know much about her service history between 1990 and 2002, but we do know that there was some kind of mechanical damage that occurred to the ship. At the time of the disaster, the ship had been out of service from September 13, 2001 to September 10, 2002 for major mechanical damage repairs and replacement of her portside engine. The extensive maintenance to the ship and the latest safety equipment should have assisted more with the disaster, but as we will later get to, it unfortunately did very little. But we do the most over here. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Alright, time to get into her final voyage. Just 16 days after her repairs were finished, MV Joola would meet her maker. She started from Ziguinchor in the Casamance region at about 1:30 p.m. on September 26, 2002, and this was a regular voyage between the Casamance region and Dakar. More than 1,928 were officially crowded onto the ferry, which remember only had a carrying capacity of 536 passengers. The exact number of passengers might not ever be known, with some Senegalese organizations putting estimates over 2,000. There were 1,034 travelers with tickets, and 185 people boarded the ship from Caribbean, an island where there was no formal port of entry or exit for passengers. The rest of the passengers either were not required to have tickets because they were children under the age of 5, or had been permitted to board for free, which was a frequent occurrence. According to a freight worker that survived, he could tell the ship would be significantly overcrowded just from the sheer number of tickets sold. People were crammed into this ship like sardines in a can, and she reportedly was already listing as she set off from Zigencourt. The last call from ferry staff was broadcast to a maritime security center in Dakar at 10 p.m. and they reported good traveling conditions. Though roughly an hour later at about 11 p.m., the ship crossed paths with a storm off the coast of Gambia. Due to the heavy winds and seas, the ferry capsized, throwing passengers and cargo into the sea, all within a short 5 minutes. Before anyone could make an SOS call, it had already happened. According to survivors, the ferry overturned very quickly in heavy rain, with one describing the ship as heavily listing before capsizing, causing a flood within the ship. Another survivor recalled clinging to the ship's keel after swimming out of the doomed ship through a partially open window, and yet another describes being thrown about by winds and waves until they could finally cling to the keel of the overturned ship. Survivors faced numerous challenges in this disaster, including escaping from the submerged vessel and getting access to the life jackets. Many survivors resorted to smashing portholes to get out, with many of the ship's passengers probably dying during or immediately after the capsizing. In an interview after the fact, Ismaila Daw, a retired diver from the Senegalese Navy who'd been in charge of security on Joola until shortly before the sinking, recalled that life jackets were deliberately bound tightly together to prevent passengers from accessing them. Why? Because apparently, quote, "it was a mess. Anytime there was a small incident, everyone would rush to take one." This is absolutely ridiculous to me. Maybe if the ship wasn't overloaded to such a dangerous point, the passengers wouldn't be reaching out for safety equipment that should have been readily available to them. I think this is disgusting, irresponsible, and heinous. Though many died in the capsizing and immediately after, a larger number probably survived. However, they would drown in the heavy seas while awaiting rescue. In an interview, one surviving passenger recalled that approximately 20 passengers were successful in climbing onto the hull and stayed there for hours. From this point, they could hear cries beneath them within air pockets in the ship that kept the ship buoyant. Hearing cries, prayers, and pleading for help must be something that haunts survivors to this day. Later on, investigations revealed that there were no alarms triggered, and no SOS signal had been transmitted to Dakar nor Zigencourt. It wasn't until around 7 a.m. that authorities learned of the capsizing from ships that passed by it. Even when they learned of it, their response was slow. According to a report released by Senegalese investigators, the Senegalese Air Force did not dispatch any search and rescue aircraft until almost 5 hours later around noon. Instead, the rescue was headed by local fishermen with pirogues that initially recovered bodies and rescued survivors. They saved a few people initially, but also recovered several bodies around the Joola. Around 2 p.m., they saved a 15-year-old boy who told them that there were still many people alive and trapped within the ship, screaming and crying and clawing to get out. Only 64 passengers of the almost 2,000 survived. Of the more than 600 women aboard, only one woman survived, a pregnant woman named Mariama Doif. Among the first responders was the diver from earlier, Ismaila Daw. Upon arriving at the ship in the afternoon and entering through the restaurant area, he found hundreds of bodies floating within, some still grasping each other's hands. When moving to the bow, he found the sealed first-class cabins, which were unflooded. Inside, passengers gestured at him through the port windows, begging for help. He would later explain in interviews that they did not have the needed equipment, like welding torches, in order to breach the hull, and opening the cabin doors risked causing the rest of the floating vessel to sink. He would admit that none of the passengers he saw alive in these cabins were saved. Joola would remain floating and capsized until about 3 p.m., at which point the flooding became too much for her and she sank stern first, taking those trapped in air pockets down to the bottom with her. Rest in peace to all of the victims of this disaster. I cannot fathom the fear, devastation, pain, and utter sadness they experienced. Despite the fact there were investigations by both the French and Senegalese governments, the exact causes of the incident are still unknown. If you're wondering why the French are involved, it's because 18 French citizens died in the disaster. There are a multitude of mistakes that contributed to the disaster, and they were all well documented. First, the Joola lacked a sailing license. Secondly, the crew neglected to consult the weather forecaster prior to departure. And the captain frequently failed to ensure proper balance of the ferry. Not only this, but other factors include possible engine failure, navigational errors, adverse weather conditions, inadequate maintenance, and overcrowding, or a combination of all of these factors. All have been suggested as likely causes. Reports later revealed only one of the ship's 2 engines were operational, despite the year-long process to replace the portside engine. In 2003, Senegal closed their investigation, conveniently placing all of the blame on the deceased captain Issa Diarra. French officials had to terminate their lengthy probe into the incident that implicated 7 Senegalese officials due to a lack of jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is the reach of an official or government agency. Rough seas and wind are attributed as the direct cause of the capsizing, though the ferry was only built to travel in coastal waters and was sailing far beyond this coastal limit when the capsizing took place. Overcrowding is one of the most commonly mentioned factors for this disaster, both for the great number of deaths because of insufficient life jackets and lack of access to them, and for causing the capsizing. It was hot and claustrophobic below deck because of the overcrowding, so as many as could fit would sleep on the upper level, making the ship more top-heavy and unstable. The ship was only 12 years old and was built to be in service for at least 30 years. However, she's suffered many technical problems in the years before the accident. These problems are now attributed to poor maintenance by its owners and not to any manufacturing or design errors. In this disaster, at least 1,863 people died. However, we may never know the real numbers due to the large number of unticketed passengers aboard the ship. We do know at least 444 children were among the victims, and among the dead were 1,201 male victims, roughly 61.5% of victims, and 682 female victims, roughly 34.9% of victims. The gender of 70 victims was unable to be determined. The dead included passengers from at least 11 countries other than Senegal, including Belgium, Cameroon, France, Ghana, Guinea, Lebanon, the Netherlands, Nigeria, Norway, Spain, and Switzerland. 2 days after the disaster on September 28, 2002, environmental activist Haidar El-Ali and his diving team explored the disaster site. They found no survivors, but several bodies of men, women, and children within the ship. 300 corpses trapped in the ship were recovered, and another 100 that were around the ship were recovered. 551 bodies in total were recovered, with only 93 being identified and returned to their families. The rest of the victims were put to rest in specially constructed cemeteries in Kabadillo, Kantine, Mbao, and the Gambian coast. National funerals were conducted on October 11, 2002 at the Esplanade du Souvenir in Dakar. Rest in peace to the victims. May they rest easy, and I hope their families have found acceptance and solace. There would be reparations and repercussions to this disaster. But there are no repercussions for our YouTube members and patrons. This episode couldn't be possible without our amazing YouTube members and patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Okay, time to look at the repercussions and reparations. Initially, the Senegalese government offered about $22,000 per victim and dismissed several officials, but no one has ever been prosecuted, and the official report was finalized a year after the disaster. Officials were charged with failure to respond quickly enough to mitigate fatalities, including high-ranking members of the armed forces of Senegal that would then be transferred to other posts. Despite this, there's little public information available about who allowed the ferry to be overloaded or maintained as poorly as it was. Premier Boy was dismissed by President Abdoulaye Wade after the disaster, along with much of her cabinet, supposedly for mishandling the rescue. In the 2007 election, Wade's rival and former premier, Moustapha Niasse, accused Wade of covering up their responsibility in the disaster. Families of the victims, many of whom have refused or been unable to claim reparation, have continued to be critical of the government concerning the management of the rescue, the reparation process, and the operation of the ferry that resulted in such a disaster. The families of the 18 French victims all refused the 2003 reparations offers, and they have pursued Senegalese authorities in French courts. On September 12, 2008, French judge Jean-Wilfred Noël delivered an indictment of 9 Senegalese officials, including Premier Boy and former Army Chief of Staff General Babacar Gaye. The reactions of Senegalese officials and popular reaction has been largely hostile, with the Senegalese government even issuing an arrest warrant for Noel in return. Associations that represent victims from France and Senegal have continued to advocate for the recovery of the sunken ship, which is believed to contain numerous bodies and lies at a depth of 60 feet. The disaster was far-reaching, even as far as Senegalese footballer Aliou Cissé, who lost 12 of his family members in the disaster, and his team, Birmingham City in England, displayed a large Senegalese flag to remember the midfielder's family and the others lost in the disaster. There have been a couple of documentaries made on the disaster, including a documentary by Senegalese journalist Papa Maktar Salane, and this was broadcast on the 9th anniversary of the tragedy on September 26, 2011. This documentary detailed the story of some of these survivors and brought the slow rescue effort into question. Another documentary for the 20th anniversary of the tragedy was made by directors Ephraim Griab and Nicola Milne for BBC World Service, and it was called The Joola, Africa's Titanic. Some of you might already know how I feel about that. Comparing and contrasting disasters is natural for human nature, but calling it Africa's Titanic lessens the severity of both disasters and makes it seem like a pop culture reference. You wouldn't call a terrorist attack here Africa's 9/11, so why on earth would you make such a comparison to Titanic when the both have nothing to do with one another? It's just disrespectful to the victims of both tragedies, so I highly encourage staying away from sickening nicknames like this one. Alright, I'll hop off my soapbox. When we talk about the status of the disaster, it is considered the second worst non-military maritime disaster in number of lives lost. The first is MV Doña Paz, lost in 1987 with an estimated number of more than 4,000 dead, and the sinking of RMS Titanic with an estimated 1,517 dead would be third, according to the New York Times and the World Almanac. The worst maritime disaster in number of lives lost is the loss of MV Wilhelm Gustloff in World War II, with an estimated 9,400 lives lost. Rest in peace to the victims of all of these disasters. It is not a competition, and all lives lost are tragic. The capsizing of MV Joola was a horrifically sad disaster with almost 2,000 lives lost. Due to Mother Nature and human error, so many met a terrifying, painful death. And that is the most important thing to remember in this case. Rest in peace to the victims of this disaster, and I hope their loved ones soon have justice. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our cruise ships, ferries, and RORO ferries playlist in the cards. Next week, we get into the story of SS Ile-de-France, a French luxury ocean liner that played a key role in rescuing passengers from the sinking of SS Andrea Doria in 1956. Thank you for tuning in to Shipwreck Sunday, have a great week, and we'll see you next time.